Most of the wine is produced in Ontario, 80 to 90%, depending on if you're going by volume or dollars. Say approximately 10% from British Columbia on the West Coast. And then Quebec, maybe 1 to 2%, and Nova Scotia on the East Coast, another 1 to 2%. Some of those they do really well. Riesling, Chardonnay, Cab Franc, Gamay, Pinot. The bigger reds tend to be in BC, where they're the last 30 miles of the Sonoran Desert. You've got sparkling wines, which are made Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, Chardonnay. And then the grapes for ice wine tend to be Vidal or Riesling. So a real mix.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 204. Is ice wine the major part of Canada's wine industry? How does ice wine compare to other dessert wines like Sauternes? And how has climate change impacted Canadian winemaking? You'll hear those tips and stories in my chat with James Atkinson, the host of the Australian podcast, Drinks Adventures. James is actually interviewing me this time. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show with the continuing saga of publishing my new wine memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. As promised, here are more of the things I learned during my legal review with several lawyers who are expert on issues of defamation, invasion of privacy, and copyright. Whenever I wondered in my mind if something could be true about someone else, I countered it with the opposite possibility in my book. An author is permitted to have speculative thoughts and questions, especially in a memoir when telling a deeply personal story and allowing readers into their mind. But I also aim to be fair and to write without even an ounce of malice for anyone mentioned. I could only do this with the distance of 10 years between what happened and when I wrote the memoir. The healing was done, and so I could write from a perspective of an older, wiser sister looking back on my younger self. This book isn't about evening a score or getting revenge. It's about sharing my story so that those in similar situations, even if they're in completely different industries, feel as though they're not alone. This memoir has stretched me emotionally, and I feel as though I'm all grown up now. And that's why I describe it as a true coming of middle-age story about transforming your life and finding love along the way. Here's a review from Dreama Drudge. She's a beta reader who lives in Indiana. Quote, I think anyone interested in wine, writing, women's issues, divorce, starting over, or depression should read this. I love her writing. It's heady and thoughtful. I love the literary bits and references throughout the book. She is so good at creating tension. I kept wanting to race ahead and read. I didn't know much about the wine industry going in, and I learned a lot. I was surprised to hear how many people are in the industry, and that it's as backbiting and misogynistic as some other industries. I love the strength the author develops in herself throughout the memoir. I was definitely rooting for her. 5 stars. Well, thank you, Dreama. I've posted a link to a blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/204. This is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know that you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at this manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Okay, on with the show.
Canada might be best known for its ice wine, a type of dessert wine produced from frozen grapes. but it's increasingly getting global recognition for the quality of its dry table wines. And our guest today, Natalie McLean, can fill you in on some of the regions and styles to look out for. Natalie McLean is a Canadian wine writer, educator, judge, and podcaster. And here, we're doing a bit of a podcast exchange. You can catch me on Natalie's show Unreserved Wine Talk sometime around this episode going to air. After we explore Canadian wine, we'll find out a bit more about Natalie's podcast and her upcoming third book. It's a memoir that, among other things, she says will explore the darker side of the wine industry. Sounds very intriguing, doesn't it? And that's coming up later in this interview with Natalie. Well, Natalie McLean, thanks so much for joining us on the Drinks Adventures podcast.
James Atkinson, great to be here. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks.
All right. It's been a whole 24 hours, I think, since we chatted on my podcast.
It has, and now I'm in the much more comfortable position of asking the questions rather than answering them, which is a relief.
All right.
Now, look, my knowledge of Canadian wine is really limited, I have to admit, but the one style I am familiar with is Icewine. Now, is that still a big part of the industry today?
Sure, it's what we're known for, along with all the other stereotypes of lots of snow, the coldest place on Earth, half the polar bears of the planet live in Canada. So Icewine is kind of what we're known for, also because we're the world's largest producer of it. So Germany really invented Icewine, if you will, but it doesn't get as consistently cold here year after year to produce it. So on average, Germany will produce Icewine 3 or 4 years out of a decade. We'll produce it every year. So yay, we've got the cold to produce it. But that said, we produce a lot more wine than just Icewine. It represents a lot of our export because it's expensive, but we produce wonderful dry table wines as well as sparkling.
We'll get onto those in a minute. With Icewine, there's obviously been an established industry there for a long time now, and there are wineries and vineyards that are set up purely to produce Icewine. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are several specialists. Most of the wineries do produce a range of wines just for the income. I mean, it's risky. Icewine, the hang time is longer on the vine. You've got more predators and so on. So it's an expensive wine to make.
And just for people who aren't familiar with it, how do you make Icewine, and what's the kind of flavour and aroma profile of this style of wine? How does it compare to other sweet dessert wines like, Sauternes or other botrytis type wines, for example?
Generally, the harvest here happens sometime between September and late October for regular dry still table wines. And then the Icewine grapes, though, will hang on the vine until December, sometimes even January into our winter. And they must be picked at -8 degrees Celsius or colder. So that usually means at midnight when it's really cold on a winter's night. Often they'll pick below that, like say -10 degrees Celsius, because they don't want the grapes to melt and they want them really to be almost like ice pellets. Now, if it gets too cold, like sometimes they've picked at -15 and lower, they can break the presses. They're so hard. They're just little marbles, if you will. But what happens is that as the grapes have hung on the vines that long, they dehydrate. And so what's left is a lot of sugar, a lot of concentrated flavor. Of course, they've soaked up a lot more sun into their skins. So they're just packed with flavor. And the flavors tend to be like apricot preserves and peach and honey. And the difference in flavor between, say, Icewine and a Sauternes is a result of the difference in the way they're made. So with Sauternes from Bordeaux, that's noble rot. So they're also dehydrating the grapes, but it's the result of a noble fungus, botrytis. Whereas Icewines are dehydrating simply because they hang on in there so long, and it's the winter, they just dehydrate and shrivel that way. So what you're going to get in Icewine is a lot more fresher fruit flavors, whereas in Sauternes, you're going to get perhaps more mature fruit flavors, not the freshness. That's not to say they're not fresh wines, but they just have a more like spicy, nuttier kind of flavor in a Sauternes than you would get in an Icewine.
Tell me about, the evolution of the Canadian wine industry then, because from what you've said, it's evolved to now produce some really creditable examples of other table wine styles.
So it wasn't until about the late 70s that the first commercial winery opened up, there was always families making wine, just as there are many countries, especially those who are immigrants from Italy or Germany or wherever they came from. But Enniskillen was the first commercial winery to open in the 70s to sell their wine. And gradually, over time, of course, more and more wineries opened up and they started learning what works well here in terms of grapes. What are the soils? What's the climate? And of course, it's all cool climate here. So think Riesling and cool climate Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc, Gamay, Pinot Noir. And now, today, there are more than 800 licensed wineries across the country. We produce a lot more wine compared to them, but we're still a drop in the bucket globally. Like, I think it's 0.3% of wine produced commercially around the world. That's Canadian wine, 0.3%. So that's probably why you don't hear about us a lot. But what we do, we're small but mighty. So the wines win consistently in competitions. They're great quality, superb, and they win across the board, not just for ice wines.
What are the key regions and what are the great varieties that you think where you think Canadian wine is truly world class?
So most of the wine is produced in Ontario, where I live. So 80 to 90%, depending on if you're going by volume or dollars. And it's the most established region. So just at a high level. And then the math isn't going to add up completely here, but let's say approximately 10% from British Columbia on the west coast. And then Quebec, which neighbors Ontario to our east, maybe 1%, 1 to 2%, and Nova Scotia on the east coast, another 1 to 2%. So in Ontario, some of those that I mentioned previously do really well. So your Riesling, your cool climate Chardonnay, Cab Franc, Gamay, Pinot. I wouldn't say we're consistent at ripening big reds. 2020 was a really hot vintage for us, so it was spectacular for big reds. But the bigger reds tend to be in BC, where they're the last 30 miles of the Sonoran Desert. It's still technically a cool climate viticulture, but they have better luck with ripening big reds out there. That said, they still produce in their cooler areas Pinot Noir, Riesling, all the grapes that I just said. And then in addition to that, you've got sparkling wines, which are classically made, the three grapes, of Champagne, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, Chardonnay. And then the grapes for ice wine tend to be Vidal or Riesling and some reds like Cab Sauv or Cab Franc. And then out in the East Coast, Quebec and Nova Scotia, it tends to be German varietals that do well in even colder climates or hybrids. So a real mix.
And is it mostly consumed domestically?
Yes. So the ice wine is our biggest export. It comprises about 80% of the wines we export. Again, it's what we're known for. But most of the wine is consumed domestically. We are a thirsty bunch, I think, like you folks in Australia.
When you kind of look at some of your favourite Canadian wines, if you were to put them next to old world examples of those varieties, is there a distinctiveness to these Canadian wines?
Sure. I think there's sort of a transatlantic sensibility, if you will. I sound like I'm hedging my bets, but we're definitely in the new world and in a cool climate. And of course, everyone likes to nod to benchmark varieties like Burgundy, Pinot Noir, or Chardonnay. So there's definitely some resonances there. There's winemaker exchange of knowledge and stages and all that sort of thing. But I do definitely pick up a distinctive, for me, the one I'm most familiar with, Niagara signature. We have our limestone. We have the cooling effect of Lake Ontario. They're nervy and edgy. The acidity in a good way makes them spectacularly food friendly with so many dishes. I just think that, there's so much potential too.
Has climate change played a big role in Canada in terms of sort of making areas that might not have been quite viable possible for, suited to grape growing?
One of our more northernly regions is Prince Edward County. It's not that far north. It's not up there with the polar bears by any means. But what they traditionally have had to do is hilling. So pushing the vineyard soil up against the vines before winter comes so that the vines don't die from the frost kill over the winter. And although they still do that, from the winemakers I've talked to, they're experiencing overall a lot warmer vintages and less winter kill. And I think what's happening here might be happening globally. For us, it's not so much climate change as global weirding, like instead of global or climate change, climate weirding, in that we're getting extreme weather events. So 2020 was so hot. And then, there've been freak hailstorms. that will destroy the bud break sometimes in spring. It's not constant, thank goodness, but it's there, and people notice these extreme weather events. So we are
Not
we
very
are seeing the effect.
beneficial then for the wines.
No, not usually. No.
No.
Even if we get El Nino effects, like a warm right into December, we can't harvest our ice wine because they just don't get to that frozen state. So anyway.
Yeah. Now let's talk about your podcast, Unreserved. Tell me about how you came to launch the show.
Sure. Well, I've always loved the intimacy, that theater of the mind of radio, having a more in-depth conversation with someone versus on Facebook, a video that lasts 2 minutes because no one's got the attention longer than a sparrow on social media. And so I'm now into, I think it's episode 166 of Unreserved Wine Talk. And it's also given me permission to email and ask for guests to come on the show whom I never would have had the courage to just reach out and say, hey, want to grab a drink sometime? And yet this is even better because I get to talk to them for about an hour.
What have been some of the highlights that you've had, in terms of guests and some of your favorite episodes?
I really love some of the winemakers who have had some colorful stories to tell, like Randall Graham, Bonnie Doon, California. He is a real wit. He's written a couple books, and he is a poet, I think, too. But he's just got such insight, but it's wrapped in this dry wit, and I love it. He knows how to tell a story. Charles Back was another one from Fairview. In South Africa, he also makes the whimsically named Goats du Rhum label. So he was a hoot. I interviewed him on the podcast.
Is that like a play on Côte du Rhône?
Exactly, exactly.
Like it.
So the French authorities, the wine authorities, actually threatened him with trademark lawsuit. So he got a busload of his farm workers to go down to the French embassy, and they sang freedom songs outside the embassy and then called on the ambassador and presented him with a vacuum sealed package of goat droppings because there's all the goats to Rome. He actually has a herd of goats on premise. So anyway, he told me with a wink, I don't know how CNN heard about this, but they showed up. And he said,
I was going to say, it sounds like a good PR exercise.
Exactly. And lots of other media. And so the French authorities backed off, completely dropped the suit. And so he said to me, anything you could do to stir up the controversy again would be really appreciated. I'll try.
Now, you're obviously best known, really well known for your wine writing as well, and have published multiple books. You're currently writing a memoir. How is that different from the books that you've written to date?
Yeah, well, in my first two books, Red, White, and Drunk All Over and Unquenchable, they were told from first-person perspective, from my perspective, and they were travels around the wine world, day in the life, becoming a sommelier, working a wine store, helping work the harvest, and so on, so I could get deeper into my topic. But memoir is a whole other type of animal. It's very personal. You're trying to marry the actual events that happened. It's just a slice of life, by the way. Memoir is different from autobiography. That's your entire life. And
right.
Only if you're like Winston Churchill or some rock star celebrity would anybody be interested in that. Memoir was a slice of life. And for me, it was 1 year, a very bad vintage. Started with my divorce and ended with a social media meltdown of epic proportions. But the two were tied in many ways. And so what people look for from a memoir is kind of the reflections. What can I learn from this for my own life? Or how can I see my story in this story? It's definitely still wrapped all up in the wine world. So there's lots of wine content in it, but it's not like the first two where let's go visit Australia and talk to a wacky winemaker who doesn't have a PR agent and will give us great quotes. This one is more about let's go behind the scenes of the wine world. Let's look at the underbelly, but also the really great parts about the wine industry. There's lots of wonderful people, welcoming hospitality, but there is a darker side that I think deserves exploration, just as I aspire to be, but am nowhere near in comparison. But what Anthony Bourdain did with Kitchen Confidential for the restaurant world, trying to go behind the scenes in the wine world, and especially for people who love wine, are curious about it, but really don't have access to some of the things that you and I both get access to, James, from tastings to trips to all kinds of things, but also just what happens within the industry as well.
Without going into too much detail, what's the sort of darkness, the dark underbelly of the industry that you're referring to?
Oh my. Well, I can't give it all away, but yes, it's
Yeah.
very mysterious and dark. So there is a piece of it, James, about being a woman in this industry. And I'm sure you've heard of a lot of the things that have come out in the wine industry recently, from the quartermaster sommelier scandal that was unveiled by the New York Times, the sexism, the misogyny, the harassment. That's not my story, the quartermaster sommeliers, but there's many stories like that, the attacks of Instagrammer women and all kinds of things. But as a woman who's been writing about wine for 20 years, I've had my fair share. And this is not a revenge book, but it's kind of like, here's my experience, here's what's happened. And it's just a way of reflecting on where the industry was 10 years. This took place 10 years ago, where it was, where it is now, and as a way of understanding the industry.
And you've got a publisher already?
Yes,
Or
yes, yes.
When's it coming
Just
out?
signed it at Christmas, but with traditional lead times, it's a traditional publisher, Dundurn Press. Usually it's a year or two, so they're going to work fast. That was air quotes right there. And it would be published probably spring 2023. So,
Okay, fantastic.
I'm
Well,
really excited about it. But yeah, it's still a long road ahead.
Oh, look, another question I meant to ask earlier on. Canada, I noticed recently, is the 5th top market for Australian wine exports. What are the predominant Australian wine styles that you're exposed to over there?
Yeah, Australian wine is really popular here. So we love your blends, Cabernet, Shiraz blends, GSM, Grenache thrown in there. Of course, the standalone grapes are marvelous. Australia really has a great reputation here, I think. And again, we talked a little bit about this on your podcast. I think there is still a stereotype about it all just being a warm climate instead of all these marvelous cool climates like the McLaren Vale or, the Adelaide Hills or Margaret River. There's still lots of education to be done here about Australian wines, but yeah, we have a great thirst for your wines here.
Fantastic. Well, Unreserved Wine Talk
That's right,
podcast.
the podcast.
You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts, I assume.
Yes, including this one, your podcast. So Unreserved Wine Talk is in all the places. And then they can also find the podcast and everything else I do, including my online wine and food pairing courses, the books, everything else at nataliemaclean.com. So that's NATALIEMACLEAN.com, nataliemaclean.com.
Wonderful, Natalie. Thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Oh, thanks, James. This was great. We have to chat again, maybe tomorrow.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with James. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with James, links to his podcast and website, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my free ultimate guide to wine and food pairing. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/204. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or want to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when I chat with Alex Zekovic, who hosts the Vintners podcast. In the meantime, if you missed episode 175, go back and take a listen. This time I interviewed James Atkinson about wine sommeliers versus beer cicerones and related tasting techniques. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
What is the difference between a wine sommelier and a beer sommelier or a cicerone, apart from the type of alcoholic beverage?
The title sommelier is not trademarked like cicerone. No one can call themselves that legally without having completed certification.
Who started the Cicerone organization?
Ray Daniels, a beer professional, got sick of going out to bars and being served a beer and the dirty glass. The beer itself might have been sitting in the keg for too long. It was tired. If you get a bottle of wine, it can withstand a little bit of abuse. But beer, once it's brewed, it starts degrading like immediately. People have this idea that a can of beer is like a can of food, that you put it on the shelf and it doesn't change, but that's really not correct. So Ray was like, we need structured education for professionals.
If you like this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a Canadian ice wine or sparkling wine. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.